All right, thank you very much. These appeals, so as you've told us all, concern proposals for the reuse of, and in one case a modest extension to, 4 existing buildings at the former Manston airfield. The appellants say that allowing the reuse of these buildings whilst the overall future of the site as a whole is resolved is entirely sensible and ought to be uncontroversial. There is now, again, so as you've said, no objection to the proposals from the local planning authority, nor indeed from the county planning authority. The only real question, we say, is whether the future reuse or redevelopment of the site as a whole would be materially prejudiced if the appeals were allowed. Now, so the appellants have themselves made a planning application for the comprehensive redevelopment of the site for residential and commercial purposes. A US-based company, River Oak, are preparing, on the other hand, to make an application for development consent to re-establish a predominantly cargo-based aviation use of the site. River Oak now say that development consent rather than planning permission is required because the proposal is to use the site for more than 10,000 cargo air transport movements ATMs per year. It seems that at an earlier stage River Oak had in mind that they make a planning application rather than a DCO application, or perhaps considered that no such permission or consent was required at all, because they made 2 unsuccessful attempts to persuade Thanet District Council to enter into an indemnity agreement with them as a prelude to the council making a compulsory purchase order in their favour to facilitate the reuse of the site for aviation purposes. If the DCO procedure is followed, then in effect a cooperation of the district council isn't required. The land, of course, is owned by the appellants, that is the whole of the former airfield and the appeal buildings, but River Oak don't have any interest in it in a legal sense, obviously, at all. Therefore, if River Oak wishes to develop the site for its own purposes, it will have to include the appellant's land interest in the site in its application for development consent, and will have to seek the confirmation of compulsory powers in that respect. The development consent order regime, of course, allows them to do this, but in order to succeed, they will have to demonstrate that there is a compelling case in the public interest to justify conferring powers of compulsory acquisition on them, and will have to show that the public benefits which their project will bring will clearly outweigh the interference with the appellant's human rights that are protected under Article 1 of the First Protocol to the European Convention for the Protection of Human Rights. And so in assessing whether such a case exists, and this isn't you, this is the future decision maker, we'll have to take into account, alongside a range of other matters, the alternative proposals that the appellants have for their land, and whether these are equally, more or less in the public interest than River Oak's own proposals. And those are the matters that the DCO decision maker will have to take into account. Will also include whether River Oak's project is financially viable and has in place the necessary funding to ensure that it is likely to proceed if the development consent order is made. Whether any financial viability appraisal is founded on realistic assumptions or forecasts about, for example, the likely levels of demand for freight traffic. Whether the project is acceptable in planning terms, in terms of such matters as obviously surface access, air noise and effects on protected species and habitats, and what conditions or other restrictions may be required to make the project acceptable, and what effect these would have on the ability of the airport to operate as envisaged in the application. Now, so given the stage that has now been reached by River Oak in the promotion of their project, although much, it seems, does remain to be done before an application can be made, that's still some months off, the appellants accept that River Oak intend to make a DCO application at some point, the latest date is during the summer, and that it is possible, of course, that development consent may be granted at the end of the necessary statutory process. And I emphasise that, that it's accepted that it's possible that development consent consent may be granted, not that it will be granted, not that it will not be granted, not that it is likely or is not likely to be granted, but it may be granted in the sense that that outcome cannot, on present information, be ruled out. The appellant's own planning application, that is for the development of the whole site, is at a rather more advanced stage than River Oaks' intended DCO application, but some further information, as I understand it, remains to be submitted, and the application obviously, of course, as you know, hasn't yet been determined. Equally, therefore, the outcome of that process is not known. Planning permission may be granted, but it may not be. Turning to the policies of the development plan, which is the Thanet Local Plan of 2006 that apply to Kent International Airport, those policies were written and came into force at a time when the site was still an operational airport. They are therefore couched in terms that we submit are plainly out of date. The local plan expired in 2011 and the airport's closed. Therefore, whilst some weight still attaches to those policies, that's entirely accepted, the weight must be limited because of those essential and incontrovertible facts. So far as emerging development plan policy is concerned, this, as it now stands, favours the comprehensive redevelopment of the former Manston Airfield as a mixed-use settlement with at least 2,500 new dwellings and up to 85,000 square metres, say, of employment and leisure floor space. Whilst that is at an early stage in its statutory processes, we submit it should attract some limited weight. Part of the evidence base for the emerging local plan policy about Manston is a report by Avia Solutions, which the Council commissioned, and which has concluded that airport operations at Manston are very unlikely to be financially viable in the longer term and almost certainly not possible in the period to 2031. River Oak contests this, hardly surprising, and they've submitted evidence to this inquiry in an attempt to demonstrate that the conclusions that Avia Solutions have reached is wrong. However, so plainly, this is not the forum in which this dispute can or should be resolved. That, amongst no doubt many other issues, must be resolved through the local plan process in which the appellants and River Oak intend, as I understand it, actively to participate. And in our submission, this is actually a very important point in the context of these appeals, and it applies to more than just the local plan. Given the range of issues which will fall for determination during the processes relating both to the appellant's comprehensive redevelopment application and River Oak's forthcoming DCO application on the assumption that it's made, you, sir, plainly, we submit, cannot reach any considered and concluded view on the likely outcome of those processes, let alone how each of the issues arising within them is likely to be decided. But we respectfully submit that the point goes somewhat further than that. You not only can you not reach any considered view on those matters, you should not do so, and should not attempt to do so, because it would be likely to cause prejudice to the parties, that is both River Oak and the appellants, the parties' positions, as their respective applications have progressed, but in particular, we submit to the appellant's position as landowner, in respect of which River Oak will have to show a compelling case in the public interest to justify the inclusion of compulsory powers in the DCO. We also submit it's not necessary for you to resolve or to speculate on those matters. You can't, you shouldn't, and you don't need to. The position we think is quite straightforward, as I've already indicated. The former airport's closed down, and there are two rival proposals, one by the landowner and one not, for alternative developments of the site. One involves the resumption of an aviation use, the other does not. The emerging local plan favours the landowner's scheme, but it is at an early stage, as I've said. These matters will be resolved through the forthcoming local plan planning and DCO processes, during the course of which the site owner, the appellant, and the promoter of the aviation scheme, River Oak, along with the local authorities, Spanish and Kent, and any other interested parties will be able to put forward evidence in support of their respective positions. And this inquiry concerns not the merits of the emerging local plan policy, nor the merits of the landowners and River Oaks' respective proposals for the wider site, but it concerns the question of whether decisions about the future of the site are likely to be prejudiced if 4 of the existing buildings on the site are allowed to be reused for commercial purposes, in effect pending those wider decisions. And we say the answer is quite plainly that those decisions are not likely to be prejudiced if the appeals are allowed. So far as River Oaks' proposals are concerned, they've made it clear that in order for their scheme to be delivered, it will be necessary for them to acquire all of the land, including the appeal buildings that lies in the appellant's ownership. Since the appellants are unwilling to sell, this will have to be done, as I've mentioned, through the conferment and exercise of compulsory powers, for which a compelling case in the public interest will have to be shown. There's no suggestion, nor could there be, that the grant of planning permission for the reuse of the appeal buildings would make the slightest difference to the likely outcome of that process. Nor, in our submission, is there any evidence of any other kind of potential prejudice to River Oaks' emerging proposals if the appeals are allowed. In those circumstances, if the appeals are allowed, and if River Oaks' project is consented and proceeds, the compensation payable to the appellants is unlikely to be much, if any, different, and as River Oaks now explicitly accept, wouldn't materially affect the viability of the scheme. There would be no significant, let alone insuperable, safety or security issues, even if the buildings were to remain in non-airport use, which is not, in any case, what River Oaks proposed. This is actually a complete answer to any suggestion there be any prejudice to River Oaks' emerging proposal. The Civil Aviation Authority were in fact consulted on the appeal application and raised no objection or any other concern, and there is no reason why possession of the appeal buildings along with the rest of the site couldn't be achieved following the exercise of compulsory powers within the same timescale. And so allowing the appeals would also be compatible with the appellant's own redevelopment proposals for the site should they receive planning permission and proceed. Finally, the appeal proposals would also bring some economic benefit to an area where unemployment rates are high by providing accommodation of a type which is in demand in the area. Whilst, unsurprisingly, given the passage of time, the occupiers that the appellants had in mind at the time the applications were made have had their requirements satisfied elsewhere, others are likely to take their place. The reuse of these 4 buildings has the potential to create around 300 jobs for local people, and we would submit that it's clear that the appeals, all 4 of them, should be allowed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.